On January 31, 1943, a Douglas Dakota marked MA 929 vanished en route to Fort Hertz. 6 men, 3 nationalities disappeared without a distress call, without wreckage, without graves. Warrant Officer Kenneth Ross Phelps never returned. His name survives only on stone. "I'll check the set once we level out," a voice reportedly said, ordinary, unalarmed. "I can't pretend to know what it was like for families who waited with nothing to bury. But this much is certain. When a body is never found, grief has no place to rest." Kenneth Ross Phelps was born on the 10th day of March, 1920, in Manham, a river town where the Murray bends wide and slow. His childhood did not carry drama. It carried repetition. Morning light through thin curtains. The smell of dust after heat. His father, John Ernest Murray Phelps, believed in doing the same small things the same way every day. Boots by the door. Tools wiped clean before being put away. Silence at the table until work was discussed. Kenneth learned early that steadiness mattered. In Wolseley, where the family later settled, routines hardened into habit. Kenneth walked the same track to school. He counted fence posts without knowing why. When radios entered local farms, he lingered near them not for music, but for the click and hum beneath it. His mother, Anna Modesta, Sophie Phelps, once asked what he was listening for. "The pauses," he said. "They matter." That answer followed him. When he enlisted in the Royal Australian Air Force in late May of 1940, the decision did not arrive in a rush. His father did not argue. He nodded once, as if this were another tool Kenneth would need to learn how to use. His mother folded his shirts tighter than necessary. No one said the word goodbye aloud. They spoke instead about weather, about trains running on time, about how often letters might come. Training reshaped him. Wireless school demanded discipline that felt almost intimate. Headphones pressed tight against his ears for hours. Fingers learning to trust rhythm more than thought. Morse code drilled until it became something closer to breathing. Dots and dashes did not live on paper anymore. They lived behind his eyes. When instructors shut off the lights and kept transmitting, Kenneth did not panic. He counted. By the time he was rated as a wireless operator and air gunner, the work had fused into him. Radios and weapons were not separate responsibilities. They were two sides of the same vigilance. Listen outward. Watch inward. Protect the space between. He carried a small notebook everywhere. Inside were frequency tables, code groups, reminders written so lightly the pencil barely scarred the page. He rewrote the same codes again and again, not because they changed, but because repetition calmed him. When engines started, his lips moved silently, counting sequences no one else could hear. On the morning of January 31, 1943, he woke before the sun reached the edge of the airfield at Dinjan. The air was already warm, thick with fuel and damp earth. He washed his face with cold water that smelled faintly of metal. Breakfast was tea and something dry he barely tasted. The Dakota waited where it always did, MA 929. The aircraft did not look dangerous. It looked dependable. Twin engines, familiar lines. Kenneth ran his hand along the fuselage as he passed, feeling the slight unevenness where paint met rivet. He climbed aboard and stowed his gear without thinking. Routine took over. He checked the Marconi set first. R1154. Receiver T1155 transmitter. Switches firm. Dials free. He adjusted his headset, listening for background hiss, then tapped a test signal. It came back clean. He logged it in the notebook. Next came the gun. He wiped down the metal hands, already knowing where grit collected. Ammunition counted twice. Mount checked. He did not rush. Joseph Casaubon, the other wireless operator, leaned in from the aisle. "All good," Clean Kenneth said. "Clear." Casaubon smiled, tired but easy. They had flown together before. Trust did not require conversation. Near the cockpit, Hugh John Monroe Campbell's voice carried back relaxed. "Weather looks cooperative enough." Someone laughed. Not loud. Just enough to mark the moment as ordinary. Kenneth sat at his station and adjusted the straps on his headset again, though they were already set. He opened his notebook and wrote a few lines, then closed it. The letter he had started the night before remained folded in his pocket. It was addressed, but unfinished. He had written about the heat, about the sameness of days, about how radios behaved differently in the hills. He had stopped before saying anything that might worry someone. He told himself he would finish it after the flight. When the engines began to turn, vibration moved through the floor and into his bones. This was the moment he always returned to himself. As propellers caught and settled into rhythm, he counted the Morse alphabet in his head. Not fast, not slow, just enough to stay aligned. "I'll tune once we're level," he said into the intercom. "Copy that," Campbell replied. They lifted off at 1:30 in the afternoon. The ground dropped away without ceremony. Trees shrank, the air smoothed. Kenneth adjusted his dials and sent a brief transmission. He listened. The response came back steady. He marked the time. From his position, he could not see far ahead, but he could sense the aircraft's balance. He felt it in the pitch of the engines, in the way the floor vibrated differently when they corrected course. He trusted those sensations more than sight. At 7,000 feet, the air cooled slightly. Clouds built ahead, layered and indifferent. Kenneth glanced at the gun mount, then back to the radio. He logged another signal. No urgency, no warning. Somewhere behind him, someone mentioned lunch waiting at Fort Hertz. Someone else responded with a comment about sleep. The words did not matter. The tone did. This was not a crew bracing for trouble. This was a crew moving through another assignment. I can't pretend I know what it felt like for Kenneth to sit there, hands steady, believing this flight would end like the others. But I can see the small choices to wipe the gun again, to retighten a strap, to delay finishing a letter because there would be time later. Those decisions were not heroic. They were human. As the Dakota moved deeper into the hills, Kenneth adjusted the receiver again, compensating for interference. Static rose and fell. He leaned closer, listening past it, fingers resting lightly on the key. This was his world signals threading through noise order pulled from chaos by attention alone. Below them, terrain folded into itself. Ridges overlapped. Valleys hid in shadow. Kenneth did not look down. He focused inward, counting again as the engines shifted pitch. The last entry in his notebook that day was precise. Time noted, frequency confirmed, everything normal. Nothing in that line suggested it would be the final one. Far away in Wolseley, his father would continue walking the same path each evening, glancing toward the road out of habit. His mother would listen for footsteps that did not come. At the airfield, the engines of other aircraft would start and stop, drowning out memory. The Dakota pressed on, carrying 6 men who trusted routine more than fear. Kenneth adjusted his headset one final time and leaned toward the receiver, waiting for the next signal, certain it would arrive. Fort Hertz existed because aircraft kept coming. Not because maps honored it, not because roads reached it, but because engines crossed the mountains anyway. From above, the settlement looked temporary, thin strips of cleared earth pressed into forest buildings, arranged as if they might be lifted and moved overnight. On the ground, everything depended on timing. When the Dakota landed, men counted crates before they counted hours of rest. Flying Officer Hugh John Monroe Campbell had flown this route often enough to know its deceptions. The hills did not rise evenly. They surged. Valleys funneled wind upward without warning. Clouds formed quickly and refused to move. He had learned to read these signs the way others read water. "Keep us honest on the set," he told Kenneth before departure. "Half instruction, half habit." "Always do," Kenneth replied. The responsibility did not belong to one man. It moved between them. Campbell judged height and angle. Nichols monitored course. Kenneth listened for direction hidden in signal strength. Casaubon watched the air behind them. Williamson tracked engines by feel more than gauge. Even Flight Lieutenant Norman Leebaugh, seated behind the cockpit, carried weight he did not speak about. He had escaped captivity once. He knew what it meant to depend on thin margins. Fort Hertz needed them all. Supplies arriving late meant rations stretched thinner. Ammunition delayed meant patrols canceled. Medicine missing meant fever untreated. Every decision to launch another flight began with the same calculation. How much risk could be accepted today, so tomorrow still existed? Orders did not arrive dramatically. They were typed, brief clipped of explanation. Maintain the route. Deliver the load. Return if possible. In the operations room at Dinjan, someone signed off on MA 929 without ceremony. Another line added to the board. Another expected return time chalked in place. Why keep flying? Because stopping would have been its own decision, and no one was ready to carry that weight. In the cockpit, Campbell adjusted throttle as terrain climbed. He did not look back. He trusted the voices behind him. Signals steady, Kenneth reported after a brief pause. Range checks out. That sentence mattered more than it sounded. It meant the aircraft was still threaded correctly into the network of voices that stretched across mountains. It meant Fort Hertz, was not yet alone. Below them, forest thickened. No roads. No clearings wide enough to promise safety. The Dakota flew where landing was not an option. Japanese aircraft did not need to appear to be felt. Their presence shaped routes long before engines crossed paths. Pilots chose valleys known to be quieter. They altered times to avoid patterns. Even so, Ki-43 fighters from Mayat Kiana reached far. They hunted slow silhouettes against cloud. Casaubon scanned the rear sector hand near the weapon. He did not speak unless needed. "I don't like that buildup," Nichols said quietly, pointing ahead. Campbell nodded. "We'll hold altitude." Holding altitude cost fuel. Losing altitude cost options. Every adjustment traded one risk for another. Inside the fuselage, Kenneth leaned closer to the receiver as static thickened. Mountains interfered with signals the way water interfered with sound. He tuned carefully, fingers precise. The rhythm steadied again. "Contact's thin, but there," he said. "That was enough. I can't pretend I know how it feels to carry responsibility that affects men you may never meet. But I can see the way Campbell's shoulders stayed squared, how his voice stayed even. Leadership here was not speeches. It was refusing to sound unsure." Fort Hertz waited, without knowing who was coming. On the ground, Kachin levies checked the sky, as they always did, shading their eyes against glare. A supply officer counted remaining tins already, deciding what could be spared if the aircraft did not arrive. At Dinjan, the board still showed MA 929 as airborne. No one erased it. At 1400 hours, a Hudson pilot saw them. A brief alignment of paths. A Dakota at 7,000 feet, steady, unremarkable. The Hudson's crew waved a reflex older than caution. They marked the sighting and moved on. That was the last time the aircraft was confirmed alive. From that point, the route offered no witnesses. Valleys folded inward. Cloud closed gaps. Engines carried sound only so far. Kenneth logged another check, though interference rose again. He adjusted gain listening past noise for structure. His pencil paused briefly, then moved. "Try again in a minute," he told himself, not aloud. Boss shifted slightly in his seat, the movement small but deliberate. He had learned to read aircraft by sound during escape. Changes in pitch meant more than words. "Everything all right up there?" he asked. "Fine," Campbell answered, without turning. "Just weather playing games." Ba nodded and settled back. He had heard worse reassurances in worse places. The Dakota entered the Patkai foothills, where maps lost confidence. Contours blurred. Peaks rose higher than expected. Air currents pressed upward, then dropped away. Campbell adjusted trim. Williamson leaned forward, watching engine temperature, one hand hovering near a gauge. "Left engine's running warm," Williamson said. "Noted," Campbell replied. "Keep me posted." No panic. No raised voices. Only attention. If this flight failed, Fort Hertz would adjust. Rations cut. Missions postponed. The outpost would not vanish immediately, but it would feel the delay like a tightening belt. That pressure traveled forward, invisibly resting on the men in the aircraft, even if they did not name it. Kenneth sent another transmission. It did not return cleanly. He waited, counted, tried again. The signal flickered. "Static's heavy," he said. "Mountains are chewing it up." Campbell acknowledged, with a brief tap of the controls. They pressed on. "I can't pretend to know what it feels like to sit inside a machine knowing every safe landing lies behind you. But I can see how habit becomes armor, how routine gives shape to fear without letting it speak." Somewhere below, cloud wrapped around a ridge. Wind rose sharply along its face. The Dakota corrected engines, responding slower than fighters ever would. Casaubon tightened his grip and kept watching behind them. Nothing there. That absence did not comfort him. Minutes passed without markers. No new sighting. No message from Fort Hertz yet, because timing said it was still early. Then the receiver hissed, louder, drowning structure. Kenneth adjusted again, then again. He leaned closer, jaw tight. "Give me a second," he murmured. That was the last ordinary sentence anyone recorded. After that, there was only waiting. At Fort Hertz, someone checked a watch and said nothing. At Dinjan, the chalkboard remained unchanged. In the Hudson, the crew continued their patrol, unaware they had witnessed a final moment. When the expected call did not come, it was not immediately alarming. Delays happened. Signals faded and returned. Crews learned patience the hard way. But as minutes stretched, someone at Dinjan looked again at the board. "Any word from 929?" he asked. "No." came the reply. Not yet. That was how the disappearance began. Not with fire or noise, but with a gap between routine reports. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to realize a flight may not return. But I can imagine the stillness that follows the question, the way eyes linger on clocks, the way no one erases the chalk line. Fort Hertz would sleep that night, with stores still counted, hoping morning engines would bring sound. Families far away would continue their days expecting letters that were already becoming delayed. The world allowed the Dakota to vanish because it was built to absorb loss quietly. And somewhere in the mountains, 6 men carried the weight of that system, without knowing it had begun to let them go. The first thing the researcher notices is how thin the file feels, not emotionally, physically. A few sheets, a handful of typed summaries, scanned forms bearing stamps that have outlived the offices that made them. The name at the top appears the same each time, Phelps, Kenneth Ross. Service number unchanged. Date fixed. Outcome reduced to a phrase. Killed in action. No coordinates follow it. The researcher spreads the documents across a desk that smells faintly of dust and warmed plastic. A computer hums nearby. Outside the window, traffic passes in predictable waves. Nothing about the room suggests urgency, yet every page carries the weight of delay. More than 7 decades of it. He begins where all searches now begin, cross-checking databases. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission confirms the same thing the Australian War Memorial does. No grave. Name listed. Memorialized in Singapore. Casper repeats the entry, with slightly different formatting. Different systems, same conclusion. There is no recovered aircraft, no confirmed wreck site, no personal effects logged. I thought there'd be more, he says quietly, not to anyone in particular. The phrase flying battle appears in one report, clipped and final. It suggests action, conflict, intent, but it explains nothing about location. It offers no map reference, no after-action summary, no witness statement beyond the Hudson sighting near Kamku. The researcher opens another folder and finds a typed note from the 1940s, edges browned. It lists the crew of MA 929. 6 names, neatly aligned. 3 nationalities. 1 passenger. He pauses at Norman Lee Ba. The name is familiar. A decorated escapee. A man who survived captivity once already. The thought settles heavily. Survival here did not repeat itself. Scrolling further, the researcher overlays timelines. Departure time, 1330. Last sighting, 1400 hours. Altitude, 7,000 feet. After that, the line goes flat. No inbound report. No landing log. No emergency transmission. In the modern world, disappearance often implies failure of search. Here, it implies something else. Terrain that resists being seen. Weather that rearranges itself. Records written by men who expected tomorrow to demand their attention elsewhere. He pulls up satellite imagery of the Patkai Range. Green folds dominate the screen. Ridges overlap like waves frozen mid-motion. Even now, roads are scarce. Clearings rare. The idea of locating aluminum wreckage beneath decades of growth feels almost hopeful. A note in the margin of one document catches his eye. Handwritten, faded. Possibly enemy action. No confirmation. Possibly. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to chase answers that may never arrive. But I can see the way the researcher's shoulders tense as he rereads that word, the way possibility stretches responsibility forward instead of closing it off. He turns next to family records. Correspondence from South Australia. Notices sent, then revised. Missing. Later presumed dead. Finally killed in action. Each change carried a different weight into the same household. There is no letter from Kenneth in the file. Only a reference to last known contact. The absence of his handwriting feels louder than the reports. At the Australian War Memorial, a digital panel shows his name. Panel 128. The researcher visits it in person months later. The space smells of stone and polish. Light filters down deliberately as if guided. He runs his fingers near the engraving but does not touch it. A guide nearby speaks softly to a visitor. Some names don't have graves, she explains. This is where families come instead. In Singapore, at Kranji Column, 430 stands among thousands. Heat presses down even in the shade. The letters are uniform. Equal. Phelps's name is one among many, but the researcher knows the line by memory now. He traces it with his eyes. A caretaker notices and asks, looking for someone specific. Yes, the researcher answers. I think so. Back home, descendants of the Phelps family keep a small box of photographs, black and white. A young man squinting in sunlight, a uniform that still fits awkwardly, a family gathered too closely, as if already compensating for distance. We never knew where he was, one relative says. Just that he didn't come back. The researcher listens. He does not correct the phrasing. The distinction between missing and killed feels administrative here, not emotional. He returns to the data. Weather reports from late January 1943 show instability over the hills. Rapid cloud formation. Strong updrafts. Pilots warned but not deterred. Japanese air activity logs indicate patrols operating from Maitkiaina that day, though no confirmed engagement with the Dakota is recorded. Everything points somewhere. Nothing points clearly. He lays the information side by side, hoping alignment will create clarity. Instead, it creates tension. Three explanations sit uneasily together: weather, terrain, enemy action. Each plausible, none provable. Maybe we're asking the wrong question, a colleague suggests over coffee. Maybe it's not where it went down, but why no one ever found it. That thought lingers. The researcher reviews post-war search efforts. RAAF parties sent into suspected regions. Reports of wreckage that led nowhere. Coordinates that did not match. In one case, a crashed aircraft turned out to be from a different year, a different crew. False hope leaves its own residue. I can't pretend to know what it feels like to realize that research may only sharpen loss instead of resolving it. But I can see the way the researcher closes the file slowly, as if sound itself might disturb something fragile. He records what can be said with certainty. MA 929 departed. It was seen. It did not arrive. 6 men died in the course of duty. Their remains were not recovered. Everything beyond that must be handled carefully. Before leaving the archive, he copies one final page. A simple list. Names, roles. Kenneth Ross Phelps, wireless operator, air gunner. That slash feels heavier than it should. 2 responsibilities carried by one man. Listening and defending. Receiving and responding. In his notes, the researcher writes a sentence he does not plan to publish. If we never find the aircraft, we must still find a way to carry the story accurately. Accuracy here does not mean certainty. It means restraint. He shuts down the computer. The hum fades. Outside evening has arrived unnoticed. Lights flicker on across the street in a sequence too orderly to be accidental. The disappearance of MA 929 is not dramatic in the archive. It does not demand attention. It waits. And in that waiting, the present brushes against the past, not to solve it, but to acknowledge that some losses remain fixed, points still exerting force long after motion has stopped. Reconstruction begins without drama. No dramatic reveal, no recovered wreckage hauled into daylight. It begins with lines on a map and numbers written in margins. The researcher spreads aviation charts across the table, older ones, first their edges soft from handling. The Patkai range is sketched in uneven strokes, elevations noted where surveyors once managed to measure them. Peaks rise higher than the route's cruising altitude, forcing aircraft into corridors that were never meant to carry traffic. MA 929 departed Dinjan heavy. Not dangerously so, but full enough to matter. Fuel supplies people. Weight changes everything. It changes climb rate. It changes how quickly an aircraft can respond when air thins or drops away. The Dakota's manuals are precise about this. At optimal conditions, she climbs steadily. In heat, in turbulence with rising ground ahead, that steadiness becomes conditional. The researcher traces the planned route with a pencil. East, northeast, into the foothills, past Kamku. At 7,000 feet, the Dakota would have been level with some ridges and below others. The margin for error narrows there, not suddenly, but persistently. Pilots rely on visibility to compensate. When cloud presses low, the compensation disappears. Weather reports from that afternoon are laid out next. Not dramatic storms, just instability. Convective cloud building earlier than forecast. Strong vertical currents near slopes. The kind of conditions pilots described as workable, which meant they demanded attention. If you lost lift there, a modern transport pilot says during an interview, tapping the map, you'd need space. And there isn't any. The researcher nods. Space is the missing resource in most mountain accidents. He pulls technical specifications for the Douglas Dakota. Service ceiling reduced under load. Rate of climb measured in feet per minute, not seconds. The aircraft was reliable, but reliability does not mean invulnerability. Inside, the reconstructed flight decisions compress. Campbell adjusts power to maintain altitude. Williamson monitors engine temperature, aware that pushing too hard risks failure, but easing off risks terrain. Left still warm Williamson would have said measured factual. Copy Campbell would have replied hands steady on the controls. No raised voices, no dramatic gestures. Just a narrowing corridor. Behind them, Kenneth listens. He hears the change in engine note before anyone mentions it. He feels the aircraft's response through the floor. His headset fills with interference as mountains block and reflect signal. He adjusts gain then frequency, trying to hold contact long enough to report position. Signal's fading, he would have said. Not alarmed. Informative. That matters, because it suggests there was still time to speak. The researcher compares this scenario to enemy action. Japanese Kai-43 fighters operated from Miat Kiana that day. Their patrol radius reached the region. They were fast, agile, and deadly against unarmed transports. But records of engagement are sparse. No pilot reported firing on a Dakota in that area at that time. No victory claims match the disappearance. Could still have happened, the researcher admits to himself. Absence of a claim is not proof. Pilots did not always report everything, but air combat leaves patterns, debris sightings, ground reports, sometimes radio chatter. None of that appears here. The phrase flying battle resurfaces in a lost summary. It feels heavy but vague. The term was often used broadly sometimes as a default when aircraft vanished in contested airspace. It does not specify fire or maneuver. It signals danger without detail. He turns back to the terrain. Controlled flight into terrain, CFIT is the modern term, but the mechanics are old. An aircraft remains functional. The crew remains active. The margin disappears anyway. Mountains do not announce themselves when cloud obscures them. Joseph Casaubon's role becomes clearer here. As a second wireless operator and gunner, he would have split attention between sky and equipment, watching for fighters, listening for changes. His presence suggests heightened caution, not panic. Nothing behind us, he might have said after a scan. That sentence, too, would have mattered. Thomas Gladstone Williamson's station sat close to the engines. He would have smelled oil before gauges shifted. He would have felt vibration in his boots. A mechanic's awareness is physical before it is numeric. If we lose one here, a maintenance officer explains in a later interview, you don't have options. You're riding it in. The researcher imagines the moment where variables converge. Rising terrain, reduced lift, cloud closing in. A decision point measured in seconds. Climb and risk stall. Turn and risk unseen ground. Descend and guarantee impact. There is no evidence of a distress call. That absence is telling but not decisive. Radio transmission requires time, clarity, and power. In sudden compression, priorities shift instinctively. I've got it, Campbell would have said if there was time. Or perhaps nothing at all. The aircraft structure would not have failed first. The Dakota was strong. The first failure would have been geometry, the shape of the land, intersecting the shape of flight. The researcher runs simulations using modern tools, inputting weight, altitude, temperature. The results cluster around one conclusion at 7,000 feet, with terrain rising sharply ahead. Options narrow fast if conditions deteriorate. He pauses the simulation and leans back. His chair creaks softly. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to sit in a cockpit where mathematics turns into seconds, but I can see how professionalism doesn't protect against physics. Training sharpens reaction, not outcome. Enemy action remains on the table. So does mechanical failure. Engines did fail in heat. Fuel systems clogged. Valves stuck. But again, patterns matter. A failing engine often produces time. Time to send a call. Time to attempt a turn. Here there is none recorded. The researcher circles Kamku on the map. The last sighting occurred near there. That fixes a moment, not an end. From that point, the aircraft could have traveled minutes more, or less. What would you have done? He asks a retired pilot during a phone call. The pilot exhales. Try to climb. Always try to climb. Until you can't. That answer lingers. Climb requires airspeed. Airspeed requires space. Space was the one thing the Patkai did not offer generously. The reconstruction stopped short of conclusion by design. It identifies stress points, not certainties. It shows how 6 people depended on alignment of weather, machine, terrain, and decision. How misalignment does not announce itself as failure until it is complete. Before closing the file, the researcher writes, one final note, underlined twice. No evidence supports a single definitive cause. That restraint matters, because forcing resolution would be easier than respecting complexity. He gathers the maps and stacks them carefully. The act feels deliberate, almost ritualistic. Somewhere in that layered green landscape, the aircraft's remains may still rest. Or they may have been scattered, absorbed, erased. What remains visible is the narrowing of options that afternoon, the quiet compression of circumstances that left no room for recovery. And within that compression, 6 lives held together by training and trust, until geometry, weather, or conflict finally broke the formation without witness, without confirmation, without the courtesy of explanation. The notice did not arrive all at once. It came in stages, each one changing the shape of waiting without ending it. First, the word missing, typed formal, careful not to presume. For Anna Modesta, Sophie Phelps, that single word rearranged the house. She read it once, then again tracing the letters with her finger, as if pressure might force them to say more. Missing, she said out loud, testing how it sounded in the room. Her husband did not answer right away. John Ernest Murray Phelps folded the paper slowly, the same way he folded tools back into their places at the end of a day. He placed it on the table and left it there untouched, as if movement might change its meaning. In Wolseley life, adjusted around the absence, rather than acknowledging it directly. Anna continued her morning routine. Tea first. Window open to let in air. The sound of birds remained unchanged. That constancy felt wrong. She listened for the postman more intently than before, the rhythm of footsteps, now a daily measurement. No news today, the postman said more than once, apologetic, without knowing why. Kenneth's room stayed exactly as it was, his spare shirts folded, a book half read on the bedside table. The drawer where he kept small personal items remained closed. Anna told herself she would sort it later, when things were clearer. Weeks passed. Then months. The second notice arrived with heavier language. Presumed dead. It explained, process not feeling. It acknowledged probability, while refusing finality. Families were advised gently to begin adjusting expectations. Anna read that letter standing up. She did not sit until she reached the final line. When she did, she placed her hands flat on her knees, grounding herself. So, that's it, she asked no one. John shook his head once. It's not, he said. Not yet. There was no coffin, no uniform returned, no personal effects wrapped carefully and handed over. In many cases, families received watches, notebooks, fragments. Here there was nothing to touch that had been with Kenneth at the end. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to grieve without objects, but I can see how the lack of something to hold forces memory to do more work than it was meant to. Neighbors tried to help. Food appeared unasked for. Conversations lingered longer than necessary. Some people avoided the subject entirely, as if naming it might summon something worse. He was a good boy, one woman said, squeezing Anna's arm. You must be proud. Pride did not fit easily into the space left behind. When the status changed again to killed in action, the letter felt almost anticlimactic. It was final, but not revelatory. No new details accompanied it. No explanation followed. Just a date already known. January 31st, 1943. Anna placed that letter with the others. She did not cry when she read it. The tears came later unexpectedly, when she reached for an extra cup at breakfast and realized she no longer needed it. At the Australian War Memorial, Kenneth's name was added to the roll. At Kranji, it was carved into stone. These acts were meant to restore dignity where bodies could not be returned. They succeeded in part. Names endure. Stone resists weather longer than paper. But memorials do not answer questions asked in kitchens. What happened to him? Anna asked an official once, during a phone call, her voice steady. Did he know? I'm sorry, the man replied. We don't have that information. That sentence, repeated in different forms, became its own refrain. Flight Lieutenant Norman Lee Baugh's family received similar notices. For them, the loss carried an added layer of disbelief. He had survived captivity. He had escaped. The assumption, unspoken but present, was that survival had become a pattern. It doesn't make sense, a relative said later. He'd already beaten worse. Sense, it turned out, was not a requirement. For the families of Campbell, Nichols, Casaubon, and Williamson, grief took on accents and customs shaped by distance. Telegrams crossed oceans. Explanations thinned with translation. Each household carried its own version of the same unfinished ending. Years passed. Anna aged. Her hair lightened, then silvered. The letters were moved from the table to a drawer, then to a box. She opened it occasionally, always carefully, as if the paper might bruise. She never received Kenneth's last letter. She suspected it existed somewhere unwritten or unsent. The idea both comforted and unsettled her. If it was never finished, then perhaps he had expected to return. He didn't think it was the end, she told a friend once. I know that. I can't pretend to know whether that belief is true, but I understand why it mattered. In official records, Kenneth Ross Phelps became a line item. Service number, unit, date of death, decorations listed, Burma Star authorized posthumously, War Medal, Australia Service Medal. The completeness of the list contrasted sharply with the incompleteness of understanding. For decades, nothing changed. The file did not grow. No new reports surfaced. The aircraft remained unrecovered. The word unanswered sat quietly beneath every summary implied rather than stated. Then slowly interest returned, not from authorities, but from people looking backward with different tools. Historians, researchers, family members who wanted to know more than a line on stone. Anna did not live to see that renewed attention, but her grandchildren did. They grew up with a photograph of a young man in uniform on a shelf. They knew his name before they knew his story. He flew planes, one of them said as a child, simplifying what could not yet be explained. Yes, an adult replied. He flew planes. The truth was more complicated. He listened, he watched. He counted rhythms inside machines and trusted that attention could hold chaos at bay. When modern researchers contacted the family, they asked careful questions. Did Kenneth keep journals? Did any letters survive? Were their stories passed down? Just that he didn't come back, a descendant said. And that my grandmother waited a long time. That waiting left marks not easily catalogued. It shaped how birthdays were observed, how silence at tables felt heavier in certain seasons. It taught caution about certainty. I can't pretend I know how grief echoes across generations, but I can see how it teaches restraint, how it resists clean conclusions and prefers honesty about what remains unknown. The human truth of MA 929 is not in its cause, but in its effect. 6 lives ended in the course of duty. Dozens more altered permanently by the lack of closure. No single moment to point to and say this is where it happened. Only a date, a name, a place that never received what it was promised. In Wolseley, the house eventually changed hands. Kenneth's room was repurposed, but one small box traveled with the family, its contents unchanged. Letters, notices, a photograph with edges worn smooth by touch. That box did not answer questions. It preserved them, and in that preservation, it carried forward the quiet cost of a mission that ended without return, felt most sharply, not in the air, but in the long years that followed on the ground. The name is cut into stone at Kranji, with the same depth as the others. Phelps K.R. Column 430. The letters are uniform, indifferent to age, rank, or circumstance. Visitors pass slowly, hats removed, shoes scuffing lightly against gravel, warmed by the Singapore sun. Some stop because they recognize a name. Others stop because the number of names feels overwhelming. A groundskeeper pauses nearby, resting his hands on the handle of a broom. He has worked here for years. He knows the rhythm of visitors. People always ask where the graves are, he says once quietly. I tell them this is it. For Kenneth Ross Phelps, this column is the closest thing to a burial site. No earth was turned for him. No flag folded into a triangle and pressed into a mother's hands. Just this place, maintained carefully, as if care itself might substitute for return. Back in South Australia, the town of Kunalpin is smaller than it used to be. Roads are paved now. Cars pass through without stopping. But the memorial still stands. Names engraved into metal plates catch the light differently depending on the hour. On certain mornings, condensation beads on the surface and has to be wiped away. A local volunteer does it once a week. He brings a cloth and a small bucket of water. My uncle's on there, he explains to a passerby. Different war. Same board. Kenneth's name sits among others from the district. Farm boys. Clerks. Men who left and did not return. The volunteer runs his finger under the line once, not touching the letters, just close enough to trace their shape. He was Air Force, he says. Didn't even have a grave. At the Australian War Memorial in Canberra, panel 128 draws fewer crowds than some. There are no medals displayed beside Kenneth's name, no photograph mounted nearby. Just the inscription. Visitors lean in to read often, surprised by how many names fit into a single panel. A child once asked her grandfather, "How did they all die?" The man hesitated. Then he said, "Doing their jobs." That answer was not complete, but it was what he had. I can't pretend I know what it feels like to become a name read by strangers. But I can see how remembrance depends on repetition, on people choosing again and again to look closely instead of passing by. For the families, what remains is quieter. Photographs fade, stories shorten, details soften at the edges. But certain facts stay sharp. The date, the aircraft number, the place that never received the landing it was promised. In one branch of the Phelps family, a small habit persists. On January 31st each year, someone mentions Kenneth aloud. Not formally, not ceremonially, just enough to mark the day. This is when he went missing, someone will say. The phrasing never quite changes. No one in the family pretends certainty now. They know the broad outlines. They know the aircraft disappeared somewhere between Dinjan and Fort Hertz. They know the official status will never be revised again. They have learned to live with that. What they did not know until recently was one small detail recovered from a secondary log. Kenneth had volunteered to take the MA 929 assignment when another wireless operator was down with fever. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a practical one. A gap needed filling. He stepped in. The researcher explains gently when sharing the finding. It wasn't required, but it helped keep the schedule. That sentence lands differently in the room. It reframes the final day not as fate, but as choice. A small decision made in a routine environment without expectation of consequence. I can't pretend to know how it feels to realize that one ordinary yes reshaped an entire family's future. But I understand why that detail matters. It restores agency without offering comfort. Fort Hertz no longer needs aircraft to survive. The airstrip has changed. The jungle has retreated in places and reclaimed others. The emergency role it once played exists now only in records and memories. Pilots no longer scan the horizon, hoping to spot a Dakota limping in low. But the route still exists on maps. Researchers still draw lines across it, noting elevation changes, weather patterns, patrol ranges. The space where MA 929 vanished remains unmarked, not because it is unimportant, but because it refuses certainty. In the end, what remains of Kenneth Ross Phelps is not a solved case or a recovered artifact. It is a collection of moments held together by care. A man counting Morse code as engines start, a father folding letters carefully, a mother listening for footsteps, a name wiped clean of condensation by someone who never knew him. The story ends as it must, without resolution. But it does not end without substance. On a quiet afternoon, a visitor at Kranji pauses longer than intended. He reads the name again, then says softly, "You were young." There is no answer. Only the stone, the heat, and the knowledge that this name once belonged to someone who listened carefully, did his job well, and never made it home. That is what remains. Somewhere between Dinjan and Fort Hertz, the Dakota never finished its sentence. The engine stopped speaking to the sky, the radio stopped carrying rhythm, and the mountains kept what they were given. MA 929 remains unmarked on any map, not because it lacks importance, but because importance does not guarantee recovery. Kenneth Ross Phelps is remembered now through fragments, a service number, a role, a name aligned with others in stone. Yet those fragments still carry weight. They tell us that 6 people boarded an aircraft, believing in routine, in skill, in return. They tell us that systems designed to endure war sometimes leave families with paperwork instead of certainty. I still picture him young, a descendant says, holding a photograph too carefully. He never got older in our stories. I can't pretend to know what it would change if the wreckage were found tomorrow. Perhaps it would offer coordinates, confirmation, a place to point and say here. Or perhaps it would only sharpen what has always been true, that loss does not wait for explanation. The flight to Fort Hertz was meant to sustain others. In doing so, it consumed the lives of those who carried it out. Their absence reshaped homes, habits, and memory in ways no report could record. MA 929 is still missing. But the people aboard it are not forgotten. They remain present in names spoken once a year, in lines traced on memorials, in the quiet insistence that some stories deserve to be held even when they cannot be finished.